Badlands. Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Good evening and welcome to the No Treason Podcast. This is episode 20. I'm your host, Jonathan Drake. This is a pre-recorded episode. I'm recording this on Saturday. So yesterday, for those of you listening to the broadcast live, my family and I are headed to watch the Phantom of the Opera. And there's just no guarantee that I'd be back in time to do a live episode, which is too bad, but got to put the family first. If we're going to say America first, then we have to say family first, because America is nothing without strong families, right? Let's see. We've got, last night was, or for me anyway, so Friday night on Only Lands, I did a little teaser for the upcoming series that Polymathenon and I are going to bring to you all probably shortly after GART, so sometime mid to late April, on ether physics, which I am firmly convinced is the true description of the nature of reality. And I think it's good to have those conversations. And there's the source that I've gotten a lot of my information from, and sort of starting point of thought process on, is a guy on YouTube named Ken Wheeler. His YouTube handle is Theoria Apophasis, and it's Apophasis, so Theoria Apophasis. He's rather difficult to understand, but the stuff that he does talk about is absolutely fascinating. Our goal, Polymathenon and I, our goal is to distill those concepts down into a way that is more easily accessible. I listened to Ken for a number of years before things really started to click for me. So hopefully we can bypass that time delay and bring the information in a way that is more readily accessible. I find the stuff deeply fascinating, and I find that it is deeply connective to a lot of issues, whether that's human relationships, whether that's interesting technologies. It explains why a sunflower, the seeds on the face of a sunflower, are arranged in the golden ratio spiral. It explains what the golden ratio spiral actually is, because it is an expression of ether, which, being a Bible-believing Christian, I believe that's the way God created things. And there's even interesting connotations as far as the way the ether functions and what I believe the Bible teaches about the nature of God. And there's a lot of interesting correlations with that. So I'm looking forward to doing that, but I want to go ahead and finish up the trial by jury book, essentially. And so we have a number of chapters left to get through. And so we'll go ahead and kick that off for this evening. And we'll start with a recap. Last week, we opened a mini two-part series within the larger context of this overall series on trial by jury by talking about the rights and duties of jurors in civil suits. Given how the majority of the ways that we are tyrannized with licensing fees, fines, taxes, etc., all exist on the civil legal layer, and as such are more likely to be ruled on by a judge and not a jury, except in a few cases, we can see how Spooner would want to emphasize the authority of a jury in this space. The fact that the system has been structured in this way, that it's more difficult to get access to a jury, and then, of course, the way the juries are instructed these days, is a tell that the architects of the system that we currently live under, they understood what they were doing, steering the enforcement of the law away from the people and into the hands of the government. If you recall the discussions on the Magna Carta, there was a phrase that appeared a lot, the judgment of their peers. And that was to indicate that the enforcement of law was not to be left in the hands of the government, not the king, not the parliament, not the representatives, not the president, not the judge. The officers of the law were there to be advisory only, but not to be determinative of any sort of a judgment outcome. That's supposed to be the judgment of your peers. And there was some question last week regarding, or at least some reference to what peers is meant to be. That'll come up more in the future as well, but I'll make a comment here that Spooner sees peers, and it seems to be the way it was understood throughout the Anglo-Saxon time as well, as being equals under the law. So it's not simply peers in the sense that they have the same outlook on life as you, the same ideology as you, the same religion as you. It's more that when the law is enforced, that person or that group of persons are equally responsible to the same law that you are being held responsible to. And this was to bypass, you could have a group of elites, and they could claim that some common person doesn't have a peer-like relationship with them, and so therefore they'd only be held responsible by people similarly elite as them, in which case they would never be held accountable for the types of things that us peasants would be held accountable for. And that is bypassed by the understanding that we are all under the same higher law, and that was borne out explicitly in the nature of the oaths that the judges and the king were compelled to swear to. Obviously, oaths are not binding in and of themselves. They're just a public acknowledgement of a higher standard, and that was seen in the language that the king swore to, that he was to maintain the law that the people chose, understanding that the law was higher than himself. And so that makes him a peer under the law as your common free person. I hinted at a deeper layer last week by briefly mentioning the critical difference that Spooner made between criminal and civil suits, being that of the intent of the accused, coupled with a discussion of whether or not the act in question in a civil or criminal suit was a natural right or not. So if the person is being accused of doing something that was within his natural rights, the jury should find that person not guilty, even if it violated a specific statute. The historical understanding, building off of the definitional understanding of what a jury is meant to be, demands that the jury is the only lawful tribunal, lawful pertaining to natural law, to ascertain the intent of the defendant. And by adjudicating no other standard than their own consciences, they, that is the jury, would be able to arrive at a verdict that determined whether or not the trial was a civil one. So an accident, obviously, if you've damaged someone's property accidentally, you're still liable to make up for the damages, or it's a criminal one, since the same act, depending on the intent of the accused, could either be simply a civil suit or a criminal one. You accidentally damaged someone's property versus you intentionally did so, knowing that it was wrong to do and you did it anyway. If liberty is the aim of any institution we install to protect it, then the jury must be the only lawful tribunal. Otherwise, our liberty is able to be defined and redefined by an institution that is highly motivated to remove it. And that is certainly the case we'll see that once we get into the history of how trial by jury was subverted specifically in this country, which mirrors the way it was subverted back in England, when that's the heritage we have, is the English common law held up trial by jury as this glorious palladium of liberty, and yet the same method of redefining it throughout the centuries was used to destroy it, and that same method was used here in this country pretty early on. Spooner will discuss this specific aspect tonight, that the jury is the only lawful tribunal to determine intent. We also last week debuted a call-in portion of the show, and thanks to EC was here, we turned our focus briefly towards how do we get there from here. It's an obvious question, because what Spooner describes, what history has recorded, what logic working from a starting point of natural law dictates, is nothing like what we live under now. So something I thought of after our conversation, of course, hindsight is always more clear, is one thing that might help us assume the correct mindset going forward is adjusting the language that we use to describe the government and the judicial system that we live under right now. To that point, it's not our government, it's their government. We did not vote this in. We didn't approve of this. We didn't ask for this. For most of us, we were born into this because most of the subversion took place long before any of us were born. So how many times are we told that congressional approval ratings are at all-time lows? What actually, or who actually approves of anything that anyone in Congress or even the state legislatures, anything that they actually do? Which, of course, begs the question, how did the legal system come to have the power that it does, with judges telling juries what they can and can't think and what they're allowed to look at as evidence and what arguments they're allowed to consider as legitimate arguments? How did that system come to have the power it does, appropriating for itself powers that it was never meant to have? It wasn't given to them, as we'll see. They just simply took it. Chris Paul often mentions the doctrine of the legal system today of judicial review or judicial supremacy. And again, when we dig into how trial by jury was subverted, we'll see that the same pattern was at play with establishing judicial supremacy with the way that trial by jury was taken away from us. They just simply, by fiat, declared this is the way it's going to be. And unfortunately, there was not enough common understanding of the issues at stake, and it was just allowed to continue. And then now the precedent of just being the status quo has been in place for, at this point, almost 200 years. It seems like an impossible task to take it back, but one of my goals in going through Spooner's writings is to establish a first principles goal that we can aim for. Knowing what justice should be can help us parse through how we might get there, at least parsing through determining whether certain actions have more or less effectiveness in achieving that common goal. But without that common goal, we're certainly not going to get very far if we're all just sort of pushing and pulling in different directions. As we coalesce around a natural law goal, better minds at strategy might present themselves and help brainstorm a roadmap to that end. I admit that strategy is not necessarily my strong suit. I don't necessarily consider myself a highly persuasive person, even though the things I believe to be true, I would consider to be persuasive in and of themselves. But unfortunately, that's just not the way reality works. You could ask Chris Paul about the effectiveness of just stating the truth over and over. It seems like the long game rather than the short game. But, you know, the horrors persist, but so do we, right? What I keep falling back on is that on an individual level, the only thing that I have control over is taking a step back from the macro level of seeing the mountain that we have to climb, the corruption we have to push back against. I don't have any control over that. What I do have control over is my own thoughts and how they relate to axiomatic, self-evident truths. And as much as I'm aware of one of those truths, I should actively align at least my mind to that truth. And of course, I have control over my own choices that I make in context of those truths. So to that end, I am, to the best of my ability, methodically trying to structure my life to better be positioned to make a transition away from their system to a parallel economy, a parallel medical system, a parallel legal system at some point. And I think that can be better affected as I take personal responsibility for my own life, because that's all I really have control over, and therefore try to protect my family. If you're trapped in a prison, running and jumping at the fence and trying to climb over might get you out quickly, but it also might get you shot and chased down by, the guard dogs and all that. Whereas taking time and making concerted plans and efforts, thinking of Shawshank Redemption or something like that, it might take a while, but the end goal is certainly worth it. So for anyone listening, I think it's wise. I'm not going to tell you what to do with your life. I think it's wise to adjust the same mindset of at least personally structuring your life in accordance with natural law and in accordance with a natural law goal. And I would say that is true, especially to kind of preach here a little bit, for people working in direct contact with the system. If you're a police officer, stop abetting tyranny. Don't enforce tyrannical laws. If you're a lawyer or a judge now, and you're amicable to liberty, properly instruct juries, properly instruct other lawyers, bring these truths to the forefront and remind people of the power they actually have, instead of working, well, this is just the way it is. If I don't do it, then someone else will, kind of a thing. That's the kind of mindset that keeps us trapped in this system. It'd be like your fellow prisoners stopping you from trying to escape. So because that's the thing, is even if you're a judge or you're a lawyer or you're a cop, even though you're on the tip of the spear of enforcing tyranny, you're also tyrannized by that same system. This goes back to the idea of being a randomly selected member of a jury, knowing that how you adjudicate in that particular case, when you go back to your neighbors, they're going to know what you judged, the way that you judged, and they're going to hold you to that same standard. And if you're ever in the same situation where you're now the accused, how you judged is going to impact ultimately how you will be judged. If your business is supported primarily through government contracts, maybe try to structure your business so that you're not relying on taxpayer money. And I understand, if you're an addict to something, you can't just pull the plug right away. Withdrawal symptoms are severe. So, I'm amicable to the idea of a gradual but intentional process of moving away from those things. So that's just something to think about as we continue through this material. Tonight, we'll be wrapping up Spooner's thoughts on what makes something criminal. But first, we have a word from the InfoWar quartermaster.
It's finally here, our second annual mega sale. This sale only comes around once a year, so take advantage of the best offers ever while you can. For example, save 50% on our Giza Dream bed sheets, as low as $29.98. And for the first time ever on TV, My Pillow mattresses and My Pillow mattress toppers as low as $99.98. And you save 50% on our Lux Pure 6-piece towel sets. Regular $69.98, now only $39.98. And our best-selling standard My Pillows, regular $49.98, on sale for $17.98. Wait on it, mega sale, only $14.98. So go to mypillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use this promo code to take advantage of our second annual mega sale. But wait, there's more. To make the mega sale even more special, when you order right now, your order's going to ship absolutely free.
And then we have a word from Pet Club.
Science proves that a healthy immune system is the body's first defense against the smallest of ailments to the most catastrophic. Coriolus versicolor is the most sought-after, all-natural supplement for both humans and pets to help boost the immune system. There are over 400 studies worldwide on its effectiveness in humans, including Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, MD Anderson Cancer Center, and now from the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine, Together, we can help reverse this terrible tide now plaguing your loved ones and give them the immune-boosting supplements that they need.
And then lastly, fellas, quick question. Is your beard intentional? Or is it just happening to your face? If it's dry, crunchy, or doing whatever it wants, that's not rugged. That's neglect. Soft Disclosure Beard Oil fixes that. A few drops soften the hair, conditions the skin underneath, and takes your beard from chaotic to dialed in. Let me check it out. No grease, no overpowering fake scent, just clean ingredients that actually work. And now we've added the upgrade, our new Boar Bristle Beard Brush. Why did we have to use that name? That is just so hard to say. But it's true. They're boar bristles engraved with the Soft Disclosure logo and ethically imported and finished right here in the USA. Real bristles, real control. It distributes the oil evenly, trains the beard, and makes it look like you meant to grow it that way. And here's the move. When you grab a beard oil, you can add the brush for 25% off. You buy the brush by itself, full price. So do it right. Soft Disclosure Beard Oil and the new Boar Bristle Brush. Visit softdisclosure.com and level up your beard game. I love my Boar Bristle Beard Brush. The way it stimulates the skin underneath, it feels really good. And I use mine every single day, and like twice a day. Usually when I wake up, and then even when I go to bed, I'll brush in some of the oil and let it soak in overnight. It's great stuff. All right, let's go ahead and get into this. Is chapter 9. Last week we were in, I think it's chapter 4, the rights and duties of jurors in civil suits, and the question of difference between civil and criminal came up. I may mention a brief blurb on that. It's the intent of the accused that makes the difference between civil and criminal, whereas today it's primarily a statutory difference. Obviously, intent, motive is part of a criminal process, but the Spooner attributes to the jury the ability to determine that in all cases. And so he has this chapter entitled The Criminal Intent. That's chapter 9. And I thought it was a good pairing for that discussion from last week. So we will discuss that. We'll begin with the way chapter 9 begins. It is a maxim of the common law that there can be no crime without a criminal intent. And it is a perfectly clear principle, although one which judges have in great measure overthrown in practice. Excuse me. That jurors are to judge of the moral intent of an accused person and hold him guiltless, whatever his act, unless they find him to have acted with a criminal intent. That is, with a design to do what he knew to be criminal. Today, you can be held criminally liable for violating a statute. Even though you did not intend to be criminal, you can still be held liable as criminal. And that's something that Spooner finds to be problematic. Spooner has contended repeatedly that all aspects of a case are the prerogative of the jury. This is because the underlying purpose of the jury is to effect of, for, and by the people. And the purpose is to prevent tyranny through enforcing bad laws that violate natural law. And then on a positive side, to enforce liberty against a predatory government. This goes back to episode 12, when in chapter 1, section 2, when Spooner counters the argument that allowing trial by jury to act as the supreme tribunal, that would interfere with the government's prerogative to establish the law. And at that point, Spooner said, and we quoted at that time, "There is no more absurdity or inconsistency in making a jury one of these several tribunals than there is in making the representatives or the Senate or the executive or the judges one of them." That is, those are the other tribunals that a law has to pass through before it becomes a law. And the argument is typically made against trial by jury that it is absurd, and you won't even know what the law is if you allow a jury to comment on the law. And Spooner argues, well, it's no more absurd than allowing these other tribunals, which are typically comprised of elected officials or appointed officials. When you consider the difficulty in maintaining transparent and honest elections, these tribunals could be filled with all sorts of bad actors. And so it's no more absurd to allow a random selected jury of the common people, trial by country, as he would call it, to be ultimately the final say. It can pass through all those other tribunals, but given the fact they could be compromised, the one that's not compromised, the people themselves, randomly selected, having a final say, that's not an absurd thing. And the point is, we cannot allow the government that sole prerogative, because look what they have done with that prerogative since they took it. If the jury doesn't have the authority to determine intent, if basically, and that is, and thereby determining criminality, then the government will determine that. They'll do it by statute. And we no longer have trial by jury, even though we have the optics of it. We, in fact, have trial by government, which Spooner refers to as a despotism. This principle is clear because the question for a jury to determine is whether the accused be guilty or not guilty. Guilt is a personal quality of the actor, not necessarily involved in the act, but depending also upon the intent or motive with which the act was done. Consequently, the jury must find that he acted from a criminal motive before they can declare him guilty. The government would like to create guilt by statute, but guilt is a quality of the person doing the action, not the action in and of itself. For instance, if you're walking across a parking lot, pushing a lumber cart with a piece of plywood, and you're just trying to get to your vehicle, and the wind catches it, as it's wont to do here in the Midwest on any given summer day, and the wind catches that cart with the plywood, it acting as a big sail, and it shoves it into someone's car. That's an accident. You're not guilty of criminal, action. You're liable for damages, but you're not liable in a criminal sense. If the car has a Trump 2028 bumper sticker, and you're a blue-haired land whale, and being triggered angrily shoved the cart into the car, well, then you acted with guilty intent. There's a difference. One's an accident. It's the same action. The cart slammed into the car, but one was accidental and one was intentional. The damage is the same, but the liability, the culpability is different. We understand this intrinsically when children accidentally break something, we as being parents, or they accidentally hurt their siblings while playing. But we can tell when an act was born out of simple negligence or just foolishness, as kids playing, and it's always it's fun until someone gets hurt, that kind of an idea. But when malice is behind the action or sheer defiance against our rightful authority as the parents, we can tell that difference, and therefore how we would address that situation would be different as parents. At least I would hope that's the case. Parents that hold their children to, for accidents, the same standard as if they did it intentionally, I think you're creating problems down the road, but that's a whole different discussion. Although kind of not really, because this is within the larger context of a jury essentially acting as a parent, so to speak, of their fellow man. Crime then is qualitative. It's not the act in and of itself per se. It's the intent behind it. It's the quality of the act. Spooner goes on, there is no moral justice in, nor any political necessity for, we quoted this last week, punishing a man for any act whatever that he may have committed if he have done it without any criminal intent. There can be no moral justice in punishing for such an act because There having been no criminal motive, there can have been no other motive which justice can take cognizance of as demanding or justifying punishment. This goes back to the discussion on parenting. If you're punishing your children for an accident as if they did it intentionally, there's no moral justice in doing that, and there's no benefit in doing that. The kid's not going to learn the lesson any better. In fact, you're probably teaching them even worse lessons, and you're destroying your relationship with your children. There can be no, to go on with a quote, there can be no political necessity for punishing to warn against similar acts in the future, because if one man have injured another, however unintentionally, he is liable and justly liable to a civil suit for damages. If your kid scratches the wall, that's how they can learn how to do drywall repair, and making them do the repair, well, it's an accident. Okay, I understand, but actions have consequences. This isn't a punishment, but this is just fulfilling your natural law duty to make right if you've damaged something. And plus they learn a good skill how to repair drywall. Going on, in this suit, he will be compelled to make compensation for the injury, notwithstanding his innocence of any intention to injure. He must bear the consequences of his own act, instead of throwing them upon another, however innocent he may have been of any intention to do wrong. And the damages he will have to pay will be a sufficient warning to him not to do the like act again. I can remember as a kid throwing a baseball against our front door, and I let go a little bit too late, and it hooked left and went right through the window next to our front door of the condo I lived in when I was a kid. And I don't remember how my parents dealt with that, but obviously they had to pay for the window. But I think they would have been, there would have been some measure of justice if, say, my child and having done that, to say, okay, well, you need to make that right, and here's a list of chores that you'd have to do to pay it back or something. That's a gray area as far as how that stuff would be dealt with. But I mean, going along with the parenting concept, what sort of monstrous person would punish their child for an accident in the same way they would for punishing them for intentional deviance? If I was intentionally throwing the ball against the window to break it, that's much different than just being an idiot and throwing the ball against the front door and just missing and smashing the window. That would not be justice if my parents, and I don't believe they did, but it would not have been justice for them to treat it as if I did it intentionally. Should I have known better? Yes. But there's a difference between intentionally doing something devious versus making an honest mistake. And honesty could also just be stupidity. This gets right at the heart of the purpose of a justice system, which is to establish justice, allowing a fiat statutory system to create blanket rules and punishments irrespective of the details of a particular case. It's sold to us by virtue of its streamlined efficiency, but the end result is to foment injustice. This is also seen in the incarceration epidemic, wherein people convicted of victimless, simply statutory crimes are locked up with violent criminals as if they were doing the same thing. That point has been brought up in regards to Tina Peters, whose name has come up a number of times in this series as being a prime example of how trial by jury has been destroyed in this country. And if we had trial by jury as it was meant to be, she would not be sitting inside a security level prison that is meant for violent criminals rather than just statutory ones, because we wouldn't have statutory criminals. With the goal of establishing justice, the job of the jury is to determine intent, the issue at hand, as Spooner calls it. And that is proven by the words that are ultimately used in a conviction or a non-conviction, that being guilty or not guilty. Spooner mentioned before that guilt is not an inherent quality of the act itself, but rather the person doing the act. This has bearing when it comes to resisting unlawful, as per natural law, a violation of a person's natural rights. A man is inherently innocent for exercising his natural rights, regardless of statute, because no government statute can justly alter that reality. as Spooner says it, make offenses by statute out of acts that are not criminal by nature. When determining what is lawful to prosecute, no arbitrary legislation can alter reality. Think back to the essence of natural law. It's the science of peace. Actions, when done, leading towards human peace versus actions, when done, leading towards conflict or war. Constantly violating natural law leads not to peace but war. That is justice versus injustice. So a government that is creating laws which make criminal acts which are inherently innocent, that is a government, even though maybe it has created order, that order has just made order out of war, not out of peace. And it's tyranny. It's despotism. If a jury convicts a person as guilty for an act that is inherently innocent, that is a usurpation of justice, and it is null and void, and a person is within their natural right to resist. We discussed last week the uncomfortable scenario that Spooner outlines involving a person defending their property, defending their natural rights by killing the government agent who had come to aggress against those natural rights, and they were in perfect rights of self-defense to do so, and a trial by jury properly handled would have the opportunity to protect that person and send a warning to law enforcement agents who may be doing something out of, they're doing something that is, they're not trying to be criminal, but they're engaging in inherently criminal acts because there are such a thing, which is to violate someone else's natural rights. So that person would be justified in defending against that. So this is the basic thesis in regards to intent/criminal intent. Spooner's basic thesis, that is. Courts have perverted what crime actually is, replacing a natural law understanding of crime being an intrinsic quality of an action informed both by the intent of the accused as well as the nature of the act itself. And they've done this in two ways. First, they've removed motive and they've replaced it with statute. And then they hide that in the civil layer. So you're being treated as a criminal even though you're stuck on the civil layer. And they have pushed the doctrine that ignorance of the law is no excuse. I'm sure you would all be familiar with that concept. So we're going to spend the rest of the time this evening covering those 2 points. So for the first, Spooner writes, the corruption of judges in their attempts to uphold the arbitrary authority of the government by procuring the conviction of individuals for acts innocent in themselves and forbidden only by some tyrannical statute, and the commission of which therefore indicates no criminal intent, is very apparent. So the corruption of judges is very apparent, and their object is upholding the arbitrary authority of government. To accomplish this object, upholding the arbitrary authority of government, they, that is the judges, have in modern times held it to be unnecessary that indictments should charge, as by the common law they were required to do, that an act was done wickedly, feloniously, with malice aforethought, or in any other manner that implied a criminal intent, without which there can be no criminality, but that it is sufficient to charge simply that it was done contrary to the form of the statute in such case made and provided. Spooner goes through in the chapter, quoting a number of previous sources where that was the basis of criminal indictments, referring to wicked intent, criminal intent, and how that has been largely removed from any indicting language. This form of indictment proceeds plainly upon the assumption that the government is absolute and that it has authority to prohibit any act it pleases, however innocent in its nature the act may be. Judges have been driven to the alternative of either sanctioning this new form of indictment, which they never had any constitutional right to sanction. By the way, we're used to sanctioning being a negative context word. You think of sanctioning a country or something. Spooner is using it here in a positive sense of essentially allowing and enforcing. So they didn't have the right to sanction this new form of indictment. So they've been driven to the alternative, either sanctioning this new form of indictment or seeing the authority of many of the statutes of the government fall to the ground. So if they didn't have this new ability to indict people without using language of intent, then they would see many of the statutes of the government fall to the ground. Because, he goes on, the acts forbidden by the statutes were so plainly innocent in their nature that even the government itself had not the face to allege that the commission of them implied or indicated any criminal intent. So there's two aspects of a criminal act. One being, and they can be independent of each other, but one being the actual intent of the person. So you're doing something you have a natural right to do, but you're doing it with the intent to damage or harm or inflict it with malice, wickedly, feloniously, whatever. And then there's criminal acts in and of themselves, taking money away from someone that doesn't belong to you, against their will. That is a violation of their natural right, and therefore it is criminal in and of itself, even without the intent. The shift in language away from a natural law basis and more towards statutory basis began as Parliament in England grew in power in the 16th through 17th century, which speaks to my contention that the deeper down the representative government wormhole we go, the worse it has gotten for us. Mens rea, the Latin term that literally means guilty mind, that is the willful intention to commit criminal acts, was still the driving legal concept at the time of the founding of this country, but it was rapidly phased into a more statutory basis as Congress and the states increased their interference into American lives and businesses. They always find justification, often noble sounding justification, to intrude upon our natural rights and create crime where there previously was no justification to create crime. But this shift away from mens rea, that is the guilty mind, towards statutory crime, with the judge interpreting the law and then instructing the jury what they should think about the law, this all shifted and changed in the early 1800s, culminating in an opinion by Justice Joseph Story in the 1830s. I've alluded to that a number of times, and we will go more deeply into that within the next couple of weeks. The first way these judges accomplished their objective of asserting arbitrary statutory authority, which is the object of shifting the language away from criminal language like wickedly, feloniously, etc. So the first way they accomplish this is by diminishing or getting rid of altogether mens rea, the guilty mind. The second, and that's what we just covered, the second is through the doctrine that ignorance of the law is no excuse. Now, if you were sitting on a jury and the accused was being charged with not paying licensing fees and permitting fees for building a shed on his own property, and his defense was that he just assumed that he lives in a free country and that meant that he could build whatever he wanted on his own property, and he had no idea that he needed to pay anyone who didn't live on the property for permission, you might be amicable to such a defense, because of course you would be. That's his natural right on his property. But the modern judge cannot allow such latitude because it undermines the entire premise of their arbitrary authority. Spooner writes, to get rid of the necessity of showing a criminal intent, and thereby further to enslave the people by reducing them to the necessity of a blind, unreasoning submission to the arbitrary will of the government, and of a surrender of all right on their own part to judge what are their own constitutional and natural rights and liberties, courts have invented another idea, which they have incorporated among the pretended maxims upon which they act in criminal trials. That is, that ignorance of the law excuses no one. If you consider the way that courts operate today, an immediate contradiction should pop up in your mind. That it's that the idea that ignorance of the law excuses no one, that's what we are held under, except Spooner points out, what else than ignorance of the law is it that excuses persons under the years of discretion, that is, minors, and men of imbecile minds, those declared not mentally fit to be charged and tried as a fully cognizant person. So already there's a contradiction in the way that judges, the legal system has been structured to use ignorance of the law excuses no one. We brush that aside because, well, you can't really apply that to someone who is of an imbecile mind, as Spooner would say it. But contradiction aside, why is this doctrine so vital to these despots? Spooner writes, this preposterous doctrine that ignorance of the law excuses no one is asserted by courts because it is an indispensable one to the maintenance of absolute power in the government. It is indispensable for this purpose because if it be once admitted that the people have any rights and liberties which the government cannot lawfully take from them, then the question arises in regard to every statute of the government, whether it be law or not. That is, whether it infringe or not the rights and liberties of the people. So they use ignorance of the law excuses no one to get around the obvious question that a person could not be aware of a law and they're just acting within their own understanding of natural rights, and therefore they can't be held liable for that because you have to prove intent to break law. And if you don't know that something is a law and you act in a way that you think is naturally rightful, then you can't be held criminally liable for that act. So that opens the can of worms to undermine their absolute and irresponsible authority and power over us, because a person could be excused, like, well, he didn't pay his taxes. Well, I didn't know I was supposed to pay my taxes. Well, no, you have to know. And we'll get into some of that here in a minute. So compare this setup, the way they have it, where a person, irrespective of their knowledge of the law, is going to be held liable against the law, the way a jury actually would function in a true trial by jury setup. Spooner writes, and no man can be convicted unless the jury find not only that the statute is law, that is, that it agrees with, it does not infringe the rights and liberties of the people. It does not infringe on natural law, natural rights, but also that it was so clearly law, so clearly consistent with the rights and liberties of the people, as that the individual himself who transgressed it knew it to be so, and therefore had no moral excuse for transgressing it. And that's possible because if you're sitting on a jury and you're thinking about the actions of this person who's accused in context of the way you would have acted, and you're like, yeah, that's so clearly, obviously wrong, dude. Like, what are you doing? Well, that's going to inform the way that you are going to judge as a member of the jury. But they remove that aspect of it, don't even allow you to think about that context of it, and they've destroyed that process. And you can see how then Spooner refers to this as the slavery of an absolute government. And they can't allow us as the people to adjudicate in such a manner, because then all sorts of laws through which they affect the extortion of us as human batteries falls apart. So because they can't allow that, they cling to it desperately. Governments see that if ignorance of the law were allowed to excuse a man for any act whatever, it must excuse him for transgressing all statutes whatsoever, which he himself thinks inconsistent with his rights and liberties, and therefore all statutes disappear. Boom, like that, gone. But such a doctrine would, of course, be inconsistent with the maintenance of arbitrary power by the government. And hence governments will not allow the plea, although they will not confess their true reasons for disallowing it. I've made the statement before that movies have lied to us. The government's not going to sit up there like a Bond villain and describe how evil they are. They're acting as if they're promoting justice and better order in society, when in actuality, they're just broadening the reach of their tyranny. Why do you think they obsess in context of this concept? Why do you think they obsess about elections so much? When have elections ever effected the result of increased liberty at an institutional and at a personal level? I think it's a case of look here, not there. Where the rubber of enforcement of law meets the road in the judicial system, that has been the actual palladium of liberty has been eroded and destroyed to the point where now we exist under this sprawling and ever-increasing statutory law base under which anyone at any given time, for doing what they understand to be natural rights, is now held as a criminal, treated as a criminal, locked up as a criminal. And we call this the land of the free. I like that concept. I'm not opposed to living in the land of the free, but it's time we stop calling something as if it were something else. We don't live in the land of the free. Maybe at one point this country was that, but it certainly since Spooner time has not been that, and it is just getting worse day by day. So how does the government justify, if they're not going to confess their true reasons for disallowing it, disallowing the idea that people arbitrate what the law is, how do they justify this insane doctrine? Spooner, that is the ignorance of the law is no excuse. Spooner knows of only two ways, and so he elaborates on those. The first one is that people will use, "Oh, I didn't know," as an excuse to get out of punishment. And because he quotes a number of law journals that were concurrent with him writing, that were expressing the common perspective on this from that system. There's no real way, they say, of ascertaining whether or not that's true. We need to just go ahead and punish the knowing and unknowing indiscriminately. We need to be fair to everyone. Of course, the practice of the courts today renders this excuse contradictory. We've already alluded to this, because as if it were not a common and everyday practice of courts and juries in both civil and criminal cases to determine the mental capacity of individuals. So we can't figure out if the person knew or not, so we're just going to punish the knowing and unknowing indiscriminately, to be fair, because we can't figure out if they knew. Well, we do figure out whether or not a person is capable of knowing, as for example, to determine whether they are of sufficient mental capacity to make reasonable contracts, whether they are lunatic, whether they are compotus mentis, of sound mind and memory, etc., etc. You know, the insanity plea comes to mind. On the flip side, Spooner points out that if a jury can determine those things in clinical cases, which experts are brought in, psychologists and psychiatrists, whatever, are brought in to ascertain whether or not the indicted or and charged person was of sound mind. So if a jury can decide those in clinical cases like that, they of course can do so with regular cases, which means that preserving the mens rea, the guilty mind, as the defining characteristic of criminality is entirely possible. And given the result of 200 years of a legal system that has worked to subvert that, is clearly preferable, because we've seen what's happened as a result of simply statute applied indiscriminately, except in a few cases arbitrarily. How it should work instead with a natural law jury, a jury then, in judging whether an accused person knew his act to be illegal, were bound first to use their own judgments, I've already referred to this, as to whether the act were intrinsically criminal. If their own judgments told them that the act was intrinsically and clearly criminal, like murder, they would naturally and reasonably infer that the accused also understood that it was intrinsically criminal and consequently illegal, unless it should appear that he was either below themselves in the scale of intellect or had less opportunities of knowing what acts were criminal. In short, they would judge from any and every means they might have of judging. And if they had any reasonable doubt that he knew his act to be criminal in itself, they would be bound to acquit him. By fulfilling their full responsibility of judging not just the accused, but the law, to repeat that, to drive it home, the jury has the best advantage in determining intent because each juror can examine their own understanding of what should actually be law and assume the accused had the same opportunity or discern whether or not they had the same opportunity, and they still acted as they did. So the first justification for ignorance is no excuse is that people will claim ignorance and therefore there's no way to disprove that. So we have to just apply the law equally, or it is really hard to disprove that. And the second justification for ignorance is no excuse is that, and Spooner has fun with this one, is that everyone is bound to know the law. So ignorance of the law is no excuse, and everyone is bound to know. So the justification for ignorance is no excuse. The first is that we can't prove whether or not they knew the law. And then the second is it doesn't matter if we can prove it or not because everyone is bound to know the law. Spooner writes, the sum of this reason is that ignorance of the law excuses no one who is of the age of discretion and is compos mentis, because every such person is bound to know the law. Spooner points out that this is not a reason. This is just a restating of the same idea. It is essentially, we are punishing you because you did not know the law. And you say, well, I didn't know there was a law against what I did. And they say, well, it's your duty to know the law. And then you're like, but I didn't know that was my duty. Well, it was your duty to know that, to know what your duty was. Well, I didn't know that it was my duty to know that it was my duty to know the law, and on and on and on. This is clearly insane. This creates a culture in which liberty does not exist. This fact indicates that this is the purpose of such a doctrine, because after enough examples are made of a person, a person is conditioned, is trained, think Pavlov's dog and the bell and the saliva. You're trained to seek permission for everything you do rather than just boldly exercise your natural rights. That's not liberty. Oh, you want to build a storage shed, going back to that earlier example, maybe to cover the firewood that you chop to keep yourself warm during the winter, that you chop down on your own property, and you're building the storage shed on your own property using materials that you own, that you obtained legally through trade or monetary exchange. Well, you were supposed to get a permit from the city to do what you did, and by all rights didn't actually need permission to do. So now you're fined, and if you don't pay the fine, we're going to come after you. And if you resist paying the fine, then we're going to throw you in prison and, see what happens there. Spooner points out that this reason is basically ignorance of the law excuses no one because ignorance of the law excuses no one. And again, this isn't an argument. This isn't a reason. It's not even evidence for an argument. It's just a statement that is to be obeyed or else. Further repudiation comes in the form of the accepted notion of the age of accountability. He referred to that as age of discretion, because it is obvious, we understand this. Even in the system today, they have a delineation between a minor and an adult. It's obvious that, like many other things, knowledge of what is or isn't a crime, even in a natural law sense, is a gradual learned process. Going back to Spooner's essay, The Science of Liberty, or The Science of Justice, Natural Law, that a child learns natural law through play with their friends, even before they even know the words to describe things like honesty and mine and yours. They already understand those concepts. Those concepts get built on and expounded on the older a person gets, the more experience they have interacting with other people. Holding a child to the same standard as a person who's in their mid-20s or 30s or 40s is clearly unreasonable. And it would not be justice to hold them to that same standard. Even within the system of statutory law, they recognize that, because that's a hard sell. But to say that a person who is an adult, who, say, lives out in the country and is used to just building what they need built, to say that they were criminal because they didn't get permission is absurd and is a usurpation of natural law and natural justice. Considering how many statutes actually exist and that there's literally no way to actually count them, we've talked about that before, and thus learn them, and they are continually updated, continually added to, it is reasonable to say that the primary doctrine used to accomplish the object, going back to the object of all this, of arbitrary judicial or governmental authority, it's an impossible standard, and it's clearly not liberty. Like I said, it creates a system, a situation in which you are conditioned to not act within your natural rights, but to get permission. I mean, how many of us can think of examples of that where it's like, yeah, I want to build a deck on my yard. Do I need to get a permit for that? That is an indication of a society that does not have liberty. If that is something that first pops into your mind, that you have to get permission to build a freaking deck on your house to enjoy the warmer weather, and you have to get permission from some bureaucracy. That's not liberty. That's not the land of the free. Now, to conclude, see, I have one more slide here. Nope, that's just a double. Okay. So to conclude, it will be covered in the chapter on majority rule, which we'll get to. But if majority opinion is what determines what is criminal by arbitrary law, by statute, then the door is opened for exactly what we have. And I maintain that that's not by accident. Everyone is seeking not true justice. That system does not promote that. Instead, people are seeking simply to become the majority by hook or by crook, think election fraud, so that they may wield the sword of the government against their adversaries, or whoever happens to be the minority, and do so by creating law that benefits themselves and oppress their enemies. This isn't justice. It's not peace. It's war, shrouded in the euphemism of electoral glory. This is essentially what was created by the formation of a so-called republic. There may have been goals originally, giving the benefit of the doubt to the founders, of allowing justice to be the highest standard. Those guys certainly understood natural law concepts. They wrote profusely about them. But the mechanics of the system that they ended up creating was better suited for the arbitrary will of the majority to oppress the minority simply by virtue of being the majority. Spooner looks to trial by jury as being the best stopgap against that potentiality. This defies all men are created equal under the law, which is what your peer is meant to refer to. Since by the law, it has practically meant whatever the majority decides is morally acceptable, morally enforceable. Trial by jury was quickly neutered in this system within the first 40 years of 40 to 50 years of creation of this country, because trial by jury eliminates that upper hand of being a majority, and it leaves the power of the sword in the hands of all the people, not just whoever happens to be the majority. And it reserves the positions of officers in government to being the masked, dispassionate executioners of, rather than originators of the law. The requirement of unanimity of a jury to convict the accused kneecaps the machinations of any attempted majority and exposes them for the tyrants they would be. We've seen how the weaponization of the so-called justice system for political ends is not a good situation. It's not good for us to do it. It's not good for them to do it. And a true trial by jury where the law is being judged, not just the accused, provides the best. I agree with Spooner that it provides the best option of defending against that. Fiat regulation, without exception, benefits a few and harms all would-be competitors. And thus it harms the common person. And as an example, consider the medical industry, consider hospitals. State licensing for doctors and for the hospital itself, this can be applied to any number of industries. Medical services is not some special category of industries, at least not in like the Austrian school of economics and thinking about free market activity. But licensing and regulatory laws, they create an unnatural monopoly of medical services that benefit only those willing to agree with the state, with the statute, as to what constitutes true health and what constitutes viable medical treatment. Insurance requirements, such as we've experienced under the last 15 years or so, only benefit those same systems, the doctors, the hospitals, the pharmaceutical companies, the lawyers, etc., because anyone attempting to practice alternative medicine is automatically regulated out of the economic loop. And the courts stand quite ready to defend that monopoly. Hospital medical services, by virtue of being funded by the government, government subsidized insurance companies and or Medicare, means that natural market forces that would normally drive prices down are totally removed from the equation. There is zero motivation on the part of a hospital or large scale doctor's office you might find on an individual level, exceptions to the rule, but there's zero motivation for the in general to provide a better service for a better price, which is typically the action of a free market. Rather, a free market of medical services protected by trial by jury means that anyone can offer services as a doctor, charge whatever price their customers are willing to pay, and the natural competitive environment selects those who deserve to succeed. Just because you went to a pharmaceutical trade school and now have a title that you can call yourself, that doesn't, if consider guys like Jordan Sather or any number of other people who spent their life studying how health works, and people want to agree with their perspective on how health works. In a natural law situation, with a trial by jury protecting your natural rights, Jordan would have every right to operate, quote unquote, as a doctor, and people would have every right to go to him seeking his services as a quote unquote doctor. Except that the legal system, the statutory law system as we have today, completely undermines that possibility. And so you're stuck going to these conglomerates and pharmaceutical funded medical providers. It is only criminal to do what I just described today because a medical monopoly has been created unnaturally and the legal system has been structured to protect that monopoly at all costs. Trial by jury, by having equal authority in civil as criminal suits and having the authority to adjudicate and nullify law and determine the intent of the accused, provides the safeguard for a free market to exist. Going back to the medical situation, if a person says, hey, I've just done my own research, this is what I believe to be true, and someone wants to try them out for a while, that's not violating anyone's natural rights. Where a person could do that and become criminal is if they said, here's my diploma from such and such a school, and they certified me as a doctor, and they made that up. That's defrauding their customers, and that's a different case entirely. That is a criminal action because they knowingly lied to their customers. Whereas if a person just said, hey, I don't have a degree, I just happen to research this stuff, and this is what I think is true, that's within a person's natural rights. And why do we have this authority as the people in a trial by jury situation. As I've said before, quoting Spooner, it's because we have a natural right to resist tyranny and any fiat law that violates natural law. As I mentioned on Only Lands the other night, the law broke the law and the jury won. It's no coincidence that with the loss of trial by jury, we have witnessed the ever-increasing nanny state extend its control over every aspect of our economy and every aspect of our lives. As I said before, if we're going to call whatever we're on the cusp of the golden age, we're only doing ourselves a disservice, and we're just lying to ourselves if we just continue on doing the same thing over and over, voting in fake elections, but then calling it something shiny and neat like golden. So with that, thank you very much for joining me for this evening. As I mentioned, I had to pre-record this. Next week, we will get back on schedule. We'll go back, I think it's chapter 5, and we'll tackle that chapter, which is entitled Objections. We already covered one of those with a question from Claire Cat. We'll go back through it again, though, just to drive all those points home. Point of housekeeping, I will be pre-recorded next Sunday as well. I have to work next Sunday night, so I will probably be in the chat. We'll see. But the week after that, we'll probably do another call-in because I ended up buying some equipment thanks to Saw This for that tremendously generous Rumble rant. I went ahead and ordered a new microphone interface that will allow me to facilitate the call-in function a little bit more streamlined. And so we'll see if we can get that rolling. It won't be next Sunday, potentially the one after. You can go to my Telegram channel, t.me/the No Treason Podcast for any updates on that. But with that, I'll say thank you again for joining me, and I'll see you all next week. Take care.
Why a spoon, cousin? Why not an axe?
Because it's dull, you twit. It'll hurt more.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.